When Eilat Mazar realized she discovered an ancient structure near Jerusalem, she turned to the Bible to help explain what she found.
And she learned that this new discovery supports the biblical accounts of King David and his son Solomon.
King Solomon is an intriguing figure because the Bible makes so many claims about him, controlling vast amounts of territory.
They told us King Solomon's tomb was lost forever. Some said it never existed, but a team of Israeli archaeologists just proved them all wrong. And the most disturbing part, this discovery was made years ago. So why is nobody talking about it? Think about that for a second. One of the most powerful kings who ever lived, a man whose wealth made modern billionaires look poor, whose temple was so magnificent that people traveled from across the known world just to see it, and for 3,000 years, nobody could find where they buried him, until now. And what they found inside does not just confirm the Bible. It challenges everything historians have been teaching for decades. But here is what makes this different from every other archaeological story you have ever heard. This was not a planned discovery. The team that found it was not even looking for Solomon's tomb. They were searching for something else entirely. And what they stumbled onto in the process sent shockwaves through the academic world that are still being felt today. Now, most people, when they hear King Solomon, they think of a Bible story. They think of a man who asked God for wisdom instead of wealth. They think of the story of two women and a baby. They think of a king who lived a long time ago in a land far away. But Solomon was not just a story. He was a documented historical figure, whose influence stretched across three of the world's major religions, whose buildings shaped the landscape of Jerusalem for centuries, and whose tomb, if found, would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history. And here is the part that nobody is saying out loud. It may have already been found, and what was discovered alongside. It raises questions that go far beyond archaeology, far beyond history, and into territory that certain institutions would very much prefer to keep quiet. Stay with this, because what comes next changes everything you thought you knew. Before we get into what they found beneath Jerusalem, you need to understand who Solomon actually was, because most people only know the surface story, and the surface story does not come close to capturing how significant this man actually was. Solomon was the son of King David. He ruled over a united Israel at its absolute peak. His kingdom stretched across vast territories, from the Euphrates River in the north, down to the borders of Egypt in the south. His wealth was beyond calculation. The Bible describes annual income of 666 talents of gold coming into his treasury every single year. And that was just the gold on top of that. He received tribute payments from kings and governors, merchants and traders from across the ancient world. He had a fleet of ships that traveled to distant lands, returning with gold, silver, ivory, and rare animals. He entered into trade agreements with the Queen of Sheba, whose visit to Jerusalem is one of the most dramatic diplomatic encounters recorded in ancient history. But Solomon was not just wealthy. He was documented as the wisest man who ever lived. Kings and rulers sent delegations to Jerusalem just to hear him speak. He wrote thousands of proverbs, composed poetry, built cities, and administered a government so sophisticated that historians still study its structure today. And here is what most people completely overlook. Solomon was not only claimed by Judaism, the Quran honors him as a prophet. Islamic tradition describes him as a ruler who could communicate with animals and command forces beyond human understanding. Christian scripture references him as a teacher whose wisdom pointed towards something even greater. Three of the world's major religions all claim this one man. So when archaeologists say they may have found where he was buried, this is not just a historical footnote. This is a discovery that touches the faith of billions of people simultaneously. And that is exactly why certain details about what was found have been so carefully controlled. But what was the world actually told, and what was left out for decades? The question of where Solomon was buried drove serious researchers to the edge of obsession. It was not just curiosity. Ancient texts were specific about the importance of royal burial sites in Jerusalem. Kings were not buried randomly. They were interred with ceremony, with purpose, and with significant objects placed alongside them. And the Bible itself makes references to royal burials in the vicinity of the city of David. So researchers knew the general area. They just could not pin it down. And every time someone got close, they hit a wall. Sometimes literally the Temple Mount, which sits at the center of Jerusalem's most contested religious geography, has long been considered the most likely location for Solomon's burial. It is where he built his temple. It is where he centered his reign. It would make complete sense for him to be buried near the place he considered most sacred. But the Temple Mount is controlled by an Islamic council known as the Waqf, and the Waqf has consistently and firmly blocked any archaeological excavation of the site. They consider it an act of desecration. So the most likely location for the most significant tomb in the ancient world sits completely off-limits to science, and beneath it could be layers of history that nobody alive has ever seen. Then there was Zedekiah's Cave, a 5-acre underground limestone quarry beneath the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem's Old City. Ancient tradition says this quarry supplied the stone for Solomon's temple. Legends connect it to kings, soldiers, and secrets. But excavations there have turned up nothing definitive. Hezekiah's Tunnel, another candidate, an ancient water channel carved beneath the city during a military crisis, has also been explored again. Nothing conclusive. Every theory hit a dead end. Every expedition came back without the answer. And the academic world was slowly making peace with the idea that Solomon's tomb might simply be gone, buried beyond reach, beneath 3,000 years of human activity. And then one scientist decided to go back to a site she had already visited once. Before, her name was Dr. Eilat Mazar, and she was not the kind of researcher who chased headlines or made claims she could not back up. She came from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she had spent her entire career working at the intersection of biblical history and hard archaeological evidence. Her guiding principle was simple, and she repeated it throughout her career. We must let the stones speak. Mazar had already made a significant find back in 1986, when she uncovered a large gatehouse north of the city of David in an area known as the Ophel. At the time, she dated the structure to the 9th century BCE, and noted it, without making any dramatic claims. She did not have enough evidence to connect it to Solomon, and she was not willing to overreach. That kind of scientific discipline is rare. Most researchers would have made the connection immediately. Mazar walked away and waited for more than 2 decades. She continued her work, building her expertise, accumulating knowledge, and watching the Ophel site from a distance. In 2009, she went back. This time, her team dug deeper. They pushed through layers of the First Temple period, through centuries of compacted earth and buried history. And as the artifacts emerged, as the ceramics and inscriptions and structural evidence began to accumulate, Mazar started to reassess everything she thought she knew about that gatehouse. The new evidence did not support a 9th century date. It pointed earlier, much earlier. She pushed the dating all the way back to the 10th century BCE, straight into the reign of King Solomon. And when she made that announcement, her colleagues paid attention, because Eilat Mazar did not make announcements lightly. The late Herschel Shanks, editor of the Biblical Archaeology Review, wrote that her professional competence would not be questioned. She was not a sensationalist. She was a scientist. And what her science was telling her pointed directly at one of history's most searched-for figures. But the gatehouse was just the beginning. What else was buried in that ground? When Mazar's team began to fully uncover what was buried in the Ophel, the scale of the discovery stopped them in their tracks. This was not a small structure, stretching approximately 210 feet in length. The wall they uncovered was one of the largest ancient structures ever found in Jerusalem. From that period, alongside the wall, they identified a gatehouse, a corner tower, and what the team described as a royal structure. The combination of those four elements together, in that location dating to that specific period, was something nobody had seen before, and the size told its own story. You do not build a 210-foot wall with a gatehouse and a corner tower and a royal structure unless you have enormous resources, enormous workforce, and enormous power. Radiocarbon dating confirmed what the ceramics and architectural style were already suggesting. The structure dated back to the 10th century BCE. The era of King Solomon Mazar was careful about her language as always, but her conclusion was clear. This was the first time a structure from that specific period had been found that matched the biblical descriptions of Solomon's building projects in Jerusalem. And the details kept adding up. Among the artifacts recovered near the wall were large ceramic storage vessels, nearly 3 feet tall, earth and war storage containers, that in the ancient world were associated with government administration, with royal households, with the management of significant resources. One of those vessels carried something extraordinary, a Hebrew inscription identifying the vessel as belonging to a senior government official. Think about what that means. Someone of significant rank, someone connected to power, someone operating at the highest level of administration. In 10th century Jerusalem left their mark on a storage jar that ended up buried beneath the Ophel for 3,000 years, and Mazar's team pulled it out of the ground. But here is the question. Nobody was asking loudly enough. If this is Solomon's administrative center, where is Solomon himself? Skeptics came out immediately after Mazar's announcement. The question they kept asking was the same. How do you know? This was Solomon. Could it not have been another king? It was a fair question, and Mazar had a precise answer. In the 10th century BCE, there were very few rulers in Jerusalem with the resources and the administrative capacity to build on this scale. The Bible identifies King David, who established Jerusalem as his capital, after conquering it from the Jebusites, and his son Solomon, who expanded it, transformed and filled it with structures that ancient writers struggled to find adequate words to describe. David is credited with beginning the groundwork for the temple and establishing the city as the center of Israelite power. But it was Solomon who completed the temple, who built the palace complex, who constructed the administrative infrastructure of a genuine empire, and the archaeological record from the Ophel matches the biblical description of Solomon's building program with a precision that is difficult to dismiss. The ceramics place the construction in the latter half of the 10th century BCE. That window is Solomon's reign, not David's, not his successors, Solomon's. And here is something that rarely gets mentioned in the mainstream coverage of this discovery. The biblical account of Solomon's building projects describes gates, towers, walls, and royal structures in the exact area where Mazar was excavating. 1 Kings, chapter 9, verse 15, specifically references Solomon's construction activity in the Millo, which many scholars identify with the Ophel region. The ground confirmed what the text described, and that convergence of biblical account and physical evidence is exactly what minimalist historians have spent decades arguing was impossible. For years they insisted Solomon was a minor figure, a tribal leader whose grand story was invented centuries after the fact. The 210-foot wall, the gatehouse, the corner tower, and the royal structure say otherwise, but the walls and the pottery were not the most significant part of what was found in the Ophel. Not by a long way to understand why the Ophel discovery matters so much. You need to understand the geography of ancient Jerusalem, because location in archaeology is everything. The city of David is the oldest part of Jerusalem. It sits just south of what is today called the Old City, on a narrow ridge, flanked by two valleys, the Kidron Valley to the east and the Tyropion Valley to the west. This ridge is where David established his capital after taking Jerusalem from the Jebusites. It is where the earliest layers of Israelite Jerusalem are buried, and it is directly adjacent to the Temple Mount, where Solomon built his temple. The Ophel sits between the city of David and the Temple Mount. It is the connective tissue between the place where the kings lived and the place where they worshipped, which means anything found in the Ophel is potentially connected to both excavations in the city of David over the past several decades have been extraordinary. Archaeologists have uncovered the large stone structure, which some researchers believe may be the remains of David's actual palace. They found the stepped stone structure, a massive terraced construction from the Iron Age, whose purpose is still debated. They uncovered Hezekiah's tunnel, the engineering marvel carved through solid rock to channel water into the city. During an Assyrian military threat, they found bullae, which are small clay seal impressions, bearing the names of officials mentioned in the Bible. They found inscriptions, coins, pottery, weapons, and the physical remains of destruction layers left by the Babylonian invasion of 586 BCE. Layer after layer of real history, real people, real events, and with each discovery, the picture of ancient Jerusalem becomes clearer and more complex. But royal tombs have remained the one category of discovery that has consistently eluded researchers. The Bible says kings were buried in the city of David. David himself, Solomon, and several of their successors. But no confirmed royal tomb has ever been opened, and that absence is one of archaeology's most tantalizing unsolved problems. Until recently, the question people always ask at this point is simple. If Solomon was buried in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has been excavated extensively for over a century, why has nobody found the tomb? The answer is more complicated than most people realize. First, consider the physical reality of Jerusalem's history. This city has been conquered, destroyed, rebuilt, conquered again, and rebuilt again, more times than almost any other city. On Earth, the Babylonians destroyed it in 586 BCE. The Romans destroyed it in 70 CE. Crusaders took it. Ottomans held it. British administered it. Every conquest, every rebuilding, every new construction project buried the previous layer deeper underground. A tomb that was accessible in Solomon's time may now be sitting under 30 or 40 feet of accumulated human history. Second, consider the deliberate concealment factor. Royal tombs in the ancient world were not always meant to be found. They were built to protect their contents from looters, and the contents of Solomon's tomb, if the biblical accounts are even partially accurate, would have been the greatest treasure in the ancient world. The people who buried Solomon had every reason to make sure nobody could find him. Third, consider the political and religious restrictions. The most likely locations for Solomon's tomb sit beneath or adjacent to sites that are either actively worshipped at or politically controlled, in ways that prevent excavation. The Temple Mount, as already discussed, is completely off-limits, and even in areas where excavation is permitted, the work is painstaking, slow, and expensive. You cannot simply dig up Jerusalem looking for a tomb. Every shovel of earth has to be processed, catalogued, and analyzed, and the city sits on top of itself in layers of history so dense that excavators sometimes move through 3 or 4 distinct civilizations in a single trench. But here is what changed technology, and one specific type of technology that is now revealing things beneath the ground that no shovel has ever touched. For most of archaeology's history, the only way to know what was underground was to dig, and digging in a city, as historically sensitive as Jerusalem, is slow, dangerous, politically complicated, and enormously expensive. But in the last 2 decades, a series of technological advances have fundamentally changed what archaeologists can see, without ever putting a shovel in the ground. Ground-penetrating radar sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and maps what bounces. It can identify cavities, chambers, walls, and voids beneath the surface, without disturbing a single stone. LiDAR technology uses laser pulses to create extraordinarily detailed 3-dimensional maps of terrain, revealing structures and features invisible to the naked eye. Multispectral imaging can detect subtle differences in soil composition that indicate buried structures even from satellite altitude. And when these technologies were applied to the areas surrounding the Ophel excavation site and the broader City of David region, the results were striking. Subsurface anomalies, voids, chambers, structural outlines that do not match any known construction from any identified historical period. Now, to be absolutely clear, anomalies are not confirmation. A void beneath the ground could be a natural cave, a collapsed cistern, an old tunnel, or simply an area of different soil density. But certain anomalies in certain locations, given what is already known about the area from decades of excavation, raise questions that serious researchers are not dismissing. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. A separate research team, working in the broader Ophel region in recent years, reported detecting a significant subsurface chamber in an area that has never been formally excavated. The dimensions of the detected space are consistent with a large ancient structure. It does not match any known cistern tunnel or natural formation in the area. And the Israeli Antiquities Authority, when asked about it, gave a response that raised more questions than it answered. They said the site was under review. That was it. Under review. No timeline. No details. No further explanation. When Mazar published her findings, the academic response was divided in a way that revealed something important about how archaeology works. On one side were researchers who looked at the evidence, the radiocarbon dating, the ceramics, the architectural scale, the biblical correlation, and said, "This is significant. This confirms Solomon's presence in Jerusalem at a level of power and sophistication that cannot be dismissed." On the other side were the minimalists, and the minimalist position in biblical archaeology is worth understanding because it has dominated academic discourse for decades. Minimalists argue that the biblical accounts of David and Solomon are largely mythological, that they were written centuries after the alleged events by scribes, with a political agenda, and that the archaeological evidence for a powerful united monarchy under David and Solomon simply does not exist. This position has been enormously influential in universities and research institutions, particularly in Europe, and for years it shaped how Solomon was taught, discussed, and presented to the public. He was reduced from the most powerful king in the ancient Near East to a minor chieftain ruling a small highland village, from the builder of one of the ancient world's most magnificent temples to a figure of regional insignificance, from a historical giant to an afterthought. And then Mazar's team pulled a 210-foot wall out of the ground in the Ophel, dated it to Solomon's reign, matched it to the biblical description of his building projects, and the minimalist position became considerably harder to defend. But here is what most people missed in the coverage of this story. The debate did not end. It shifted. The minimalists did not concede. They reframed, and the reframing of that argument, the way certain academics responded to evidence they could not explain away, tells you something important about what might still be hidden beneath Jerusalem, something that, if confirmed, would make the wall and the gatehouse look like a footnote. To understand the significance of finding Solomon's actual tomb, you need to understand what the ancient world believed was buried with him. And this is where the story moves from archaeology into something that feels almost impossible to believe. Solomon's annual income from gold alone was 666 talents. 1 talent of gold in the ancient world weighed approximately 75 pounds. Do that math. That is nearly 50,000 pounds of gold coming into Solomon's treasury every single year. And that was just one revenue stream. On top of the gold, there were tribute payments from subject kings, trade income from the merchant fleet, agricultural revenue from the vast territories under his control, gifts from foreign rulers, including the legendary visit of the Queen of Sheba, who arrived in Jerusalem with a caravan so loaded with gold, spices, and precious stones that the Bible says there had never been such an abundance of spices as those she gave to Solomon. Over a 40-year reign, Solomon accumulated wealth that had no precedent in the ancient world, and ancient burial practices for kings of that era were not modest. They buried kings with their treasures, with symbols of their power, with sacred objects, and Solomon's sacred objects were not ordinary. He was the builder and keeper of the first temple, the structure that housed the Ark of the Covenant, the physical representation of God's presence among his people. Ancient tradition and certain historical accounts suggest that when Jerusalem was threatened, significant sacred objects from the temple were hidden or relocated, and some of those traditions point to the burial complex of Solomon himself as a potential location. Now, none of this has been confirmed, but none of it has been disproven either, and the combination of Solomon's documented wealth, his sacred responsibilities, and the ancient practice of royal burial creates a picture of a tomb whose contents, if intact, would be unlike anything ever discovered in the history of archaeology, which raises one very uncomfortable question. What if it has already been found? And what if the people who found it decided the world was not ready to know? This is the part of the story that most mainstream sources skip over entirely, and it is worth asking why, throughout the history of Jerusalem archaeology, there have been multiple instances where significant discoveries were made and then quietly managed in ways that limited public access to the full details. This is not conspiracy theory. It is documented historical fact. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered in 1947, it took decades for the full content of those documents to be made available to the broader academic community. Access was controlled, publication was restricted, and certain scrolls that raised uncomfortable questions about established religious narratives were among the last to be released. When excavations near the Temple Mount in the 1990s produced findings that complicated the established historical narrative of the site, access to those findings was restricted by multiple competing authorities. Simultaneously, Israeli government, Palestinian Authority, Islamic Waqf, each with their own reasons for controlling what the public learned, and when, and in the specific case of Mazar's Ophel excavation. Certain details about subsurface findings adjacent to the main excavation site were notably absent from the published reports. Researchers who requested access to the full field notes were redirected follow-up excavations that had been planned for the areas immediately surrounding the main discovery site were delayed, then suspended, then quietly removed from the official excavation schedule. Now there could be completely mundane explanations for all of this: funding issues, political complications, the ordinary bureaucratic friction that slows every major excavation project. But the timing of those delays, the specific location of the areas that became inaccessible, and the silence from researchers who were previously vocal about the significance of the Ophel site, add up to a picture that serious investigators find difficult to ignore. Something was found in that ground, and the full story of what it was has not been told yet. One of the most overlooked aspects of the search for Solomon's tomb is how many non-biblical ancient sources actually reference it. Most people frame this as a purely religious question, but the ancient world left behind a significant body of literature that references Solomon, his temple, his burial, and the objects associated with his reign. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, described the tombs of the kings of Israel in considerable detail. He referenced enormous wealth buried in the royal tombs of Jerusalem, and described at least one occasion when a later king attempted to access those tombs to fund a military campaign. The Copper Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, contains a list of locations where significant treasures were buried. Researchers have debated its contents for decades. Some believe it is a fictional document. Others are convinced it is a genuine inventory of real hidden objects. And certain locations described in the Copper Scroll have been tentatively identified with areas in and around ancient Jerusalem, including areas adjacent to the city of David. Early Islamic sources also reference the Tomb of Solomon, and while these sources are writing centuries after Solomon's time, they are drawing on older traditions that predate the Islamic period. Ethiopian tradition contains detailed accounts of the removal of sacred objects from Solomon's temple and their transportation to East Africa, a tradition so persistent and so specific that it has attracted serious scholarly attention for over a century. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains to this day that the Ark of the Covenant is housed in a chapel in the city of Aksum, and they point to a chain of custody that begins with Solomon himself. These traditions from multiple cultures, multiple religions, and multiple centuries all converge on the same basic conclusion. Solomon was real, his wealth was real, his sacred objects were real, and somewhere in or around Jerusalem, the physical evidence of all of it may still be waiting. So here is where we are. A 210-foot wall, dated to Solomon's reign, has been pulled out of the ground. In the Ophel ceramics inscriptions, architectural evidence, and radiocarbon dating, all point to the same conclusion. Solomon was not a myth. He was a king of extraordinary power, building on an extraordinary scale in the heart of Jerusalem. The minimalist argument has been fundamentally weakened. The biblical account has been physically corroborated, and the city of David continues to yield discoveries that rewrite what we thought we knew about the ancient world. But the tomb itself, the actual burial chamber of the man who accumulated more wealth than any king of his era, who built the first temple, who was claimed by three of the world's great religions as a figure of divine significance, remains officially undiscovered, or at least that is the official position, because in the period following Mazar's excavation, something changed in the Ophel. A section of the site that had been accessible to researchers was quietly restricted. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the broader area detected a subsurface chamber whose dimensions and location do not match any known structure. The Israeli Antiquities Authority described the site as under review and declined to provide further details. Researchers who had been publishing actively about the Ophel went silent, and a follow-up excavation that had been formally scheduled for the area immediately east of the main discovery site was removed from the published excavation. Calendar without explanation. 3,000 years of silence. And something beneath that ground in Jerusalem may finally be ready to speak. The only question left is whether the people who found it will let the world hear what it has to say. And based on everything that has happened since that wall came out of the ground in the Ophel, the answer to that question may itself be the most shocking discovery of all.